Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second Art School event. Art School is a collaboration between Afterall and Central St. Martin's and the Museum of Art in Sao Paulo. So just before we start, I just want to say a quick thank you to colleagues at CSM. Thanks to Mick Finch, Alex Shady, Alison Green, Graham Ellard, and to Madeline King for all of her help behind the scenes. And also to Andrea Mesquita and Amanda Carnero at MASPE. So today we're joined by Julia Morandeira, who together with Adeena May, our Afterall journal editor, is going to be discussing Adelita Husni-Bey's Postcards from the Desert Island. For those of you who don't already know, Julia is a curator and researcher based in Madrid. She's director of the Escuelita at the Centro de Arte 2 de Mayo. And she's also developing an informal school which looks into expanded choreography and feminism. That's in Warsaw, and it's due to open in 2021. We're going to have about half an hour of discussion between Julia and Adeena here on, as per all of our art school events, themes of teaching and learning in art in the present moment, but through the lens of art history. And then during that time, please ask as many questions as you want through the chat, and then we will I will reappear and bring those questions to Julia in the second half of the discussion. And the same goes to anyone who's joined us via YouTube. You can also ask questions through the YouTube chat, and I'll bring them into this discussion on Zoom as well. I think that's basically it. So I'm going to hand over to Adeena now.
Thanks, Amber. And thanks, Julia, for joining us today, and thanks to everyone who is joining or in the process of joining our Zoom webinar or the streaming on YouTube. But before I move into making my first comment or asking my first question, Julia, I'll just say a few words about why we decided to select Adelita's work as part of this new platform, Art School. So for those who were with us already last Monday, you'll have noticed that we jumped, from the 18th century with Eva Layer-Burkhardt's conversation with Marc Lewis on Jean Simon's Chardin painting, The Young Schoolmistress, to the recent, to a more contemporary and more recent take on the question of pedagogy. Because I mean, when we started conceiving of art school as a platform to reflect on the role of art teaching and pedagogy in the current crisis, one desire was to include and select various works from different historical periods, but also that unfold across very different media. So from an 18th century French painting, we're going to talk today about a more performative or performance-based video work by a young artist, Adelita Husni-Bey, who is based between the US and Milan. And as Amber introduction, I already made clear, I think, pairing Julia and Adelita was kind of a natural choice, because Julia has been involved in questions of education, pedagogy. She teaches at the Dutch Art Institute. And you're developing this a new alternative experimental school format around histories of performance and choreography. Correct me if I'm wrong. And Adelita, of course, we're talking about one work today, and in the piece you wrote for art school, but she, as an artist, I think, is exemplary of someone who does research-based work into certain histories, specifically histories of anarchism, histories of self-organized, autonomous institutions and structures. So it only came as a, I mean, it was a very obvious choice to, and actually it was really important to include Adelita in our selection of artworks for art school, because it will give us hopefully to raise lots of very urgent questions at the intersections of art practice, education, but also politics, as those of you who have read the piece will have noticed. So perhaps, yeah, my first to kick off, my first question or comment is as I mentioned, Desert from a Postcard Island is inspired by a range of histories, histories of anarchist pedagogies, alternative educations, experimental schools, a lot of which developed in the 60s, 70s. In your text, you mentioned a range of authors and theoreticians of education or educators, and this specific piece is set in a school which continues a certain branch of this tradition, which is called the École Vitruve, so the Vitruve school. So perhaps we could start about a bit of context about the school and that setting.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you, both to you, Adeena and Amber, for all the preparation, especially the amazing edition of the essay that you've helped me with. And of course, Afterall, and the other collaborators, MASP and Central St. Martin's, for this invitation to participate to the art school project. So I also wanted to thank you for this very rich introduction, because it has given me a lot of food for thought to actually start thinking with you and thinking with the piece still of several issues that it touches upon. But to begin with, it is true that the École Vitruve is quite an important protagonist of the project. Adelita was already interested and engaging in different pedagogies, in different forms of pedagogy. And especially she was really interested in anarcho-collectivisms, how the pedagogies that were developed by these political currents, but not only, also different movements and forms of structuring, forms of life, alternative or counter-hegemonic to the normative ones, were actually structuring pedagogy as a central vector, or as a central force to actually institute a transformation of life in society or life in common. She was at the time participating in different meetings, for example, of the Radical Education Network, that in the UK was already working through the different meetings, production of tools and resources and meetings, different conversations, discussions into other forms of pedagogy that needed or that were requested to actually respond to the different crises and urgencies that were happening at the moment, and not just in the moment, but also historically in education, especially in the British education system. So when Adelita, she was invited to a residency in Paris, and she started contacting to different schools that had been, as you mentioned, founded in the 50s and in the 60s, and that had already had a very long and sustained practice and experience of with other forms of pedagogies that are based, for example, such as is the case of École Vitruve, in non-competition but in cooperation models of education, and especially not just like cooperation, but actually active methodologies. Because the École Vitruve was founded in the 50s and in the mid 50s by Robert Glotin, who was one very active militant of what was called the new education, la nouvelle éducation, which was part of a larger movement of renewal of education, which was happening in the United States, in Italy, with figures such as Maria Montessori, John Dewey, etc., etc. So it was a moment, I think, like since the end of the 19th century until basically after the Second World War, there was a very strong current of reformation of education, in which the École Vitruve is it's inheriting all this movement. And also an important information to have in mind is that the École Vitruve was founded really in the aftermath of the Algerian War. So in the aftermath of the first decolonization process of the French Empire, with all the subsequent consequences of migration and of the reception of migrants, both Pieds Noirs and Algerian migrants in Paris, and the need to create forms, pedagogical institutions for all the new populations and the new that were starting to settle in the outskirts of Paris. So I think like this is also a really important bit of information to see how also this more experimental form of education was permitted in a very exceptional moment of history, and in a very much exceptional moment of especially like of French history, which it's also something like really interesting to see in regards to the history of education, how certain experimental measures are normally implied in this exceptional situation, which sometimes are for the good and sometimes are actually just like really sustaining the massive inequalities in which the different schools are founded. But I think like in this case, it started as one school of a series of schools that were to be founded in the following years, and till this day, the École Vitruve, and then of course there's other forms of high school and higher education which are based in self-run models that still persist in Paris. But the École Vitruve is the only one of its kind at this moment, no? And basically, I think it was very important for Adelita to engage with this school because of the philosophy and the politics and the ethos that are behind this project. As I argue in my text, and also for those of you who have seen the piece proposes to develop a 3-week undirected workshop in which the students, in this case, kids that are aged from 7 to 11 years old, need to build from scratch life in a society, life in a desert island. So the framework of a school permitting these forms of like workshop that were to be developed throughout the whole 3 weeks. So in a very intensively mode in which the students are engaging in that activity, and that activity is understood as fully educational. I mean, it's not done on the side to other more systematized or more curricular courses or subjects, but that the workshop is actually like the engine that structures and articulates those 3 weeks. Is really important for the experience to take a more full-bodied experience in a sense.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's remarkable in so many ways. And by the way, a parenthesis, but of course, so everyone can read Julia's text on afterallartschool.org. But there's also a link to Adelita's film, which can be viewed for free on the website of Cadiz Foundation. You have to register, but the piece is free to watch. But yeah, what I wanted to say is it's not only remarkable because not so many of these experiments, and they're not only in pedagogy, but there's they emerge at a time when people question every segment of society, and that has a lot of echoes with other experiments in the vicinity of antipsychiatry, like the Clinic of La Borde, which was founded by Félix Guattari and Jean Houry outside of Paris. Or there's an institution in Switzerland called Le Chiffre de la Parole, which also still exists today. But a lot of these attempts have not survived after during the 80s, when more liberal policies have started to be implemented in Europe. So it's already remarkable that this school still exists, but that this pedagogy has evolved, and that there's a very we get a sense that this is a very strong experiment, and that around which looks like something that looks like a theater play with children as actors. We really get a sense that it's really magnifying the way hierarchies, but also the questioning hierarchies, different social forces, how the division of labor can be put into question, or can be reproduced along social norms, as you write really well. So there's really this movement between a very specific experiment and potentially it's opening a window to other forms of living.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, there's this, but the fact that it takes the format of something performative, of a play, but which is at the same time, as you said, the actual form of the curriculum in the Vitruve school.
Mm-hmm. I think there's something very important that Adelita's work addresses, not just in this piece, which is actually quite seminal in regards to her later production, for many issues that I will explain now, that in formal terms, and is as you mentioned, how the school is a site of connection to other forms of responding or resistance to normative or hegemonic forms of living. And I think that actually touches upon the heart of many of Adelita's interests, which is how to think systematically and how to organize accordingly to propose different alternatives, different solutions that actually allow us to operationalize that change. I think that's why she's so interested, for example, now in abolitionism, mm-hmm. Which is not how, paraphrasing Ruth Wilson Gilmore, is not how to destroy prisons, but actually asking the reasons why prisons became a solution to the punishment problem in society, right? But if we see other works of her, this systematic thinking is really at the core of the tensions and the negotiations she puts into place. And in this regards, I think like the workshop format, which she uses in Postcards from the Desert Island, I think if it's not the first work in which she uses it, is the one in which the workshop is really at the core of the work, and it's going to become a steady, a recurrent tool for her in her work, not just as an artist, but also as a pedagogue, as an activist, as a person that enables situations, experiences, discussions, etc. And the centrality of the workshop takes many times, such as in the case again of Postcard, the form of a theater play. I mean, it's theatralized forms of workshop that allow her, on the one hand, to transpose the performativity of social life, which is the case of Postcard from the Desert Island, but also to touch upon questions of symbolization, of role playing, well, many other, even fiction, speculation, many different vectors that allow her to deal in a not literal way, but actually in a proactive and in a very productive way with the different tensions that she's looking at in her different works. No, I'm thinking, for example, of Chiron, the exhibition and the film she produced for the new museum, in which she worked with Unlocal, an organization that offers pro bono defense for people facing deportation in New York. This is as a work that she developed in 2018, which she followed again long temporalities in which she gets in contact with the different participants of the workshop, in which she works with them in the different key issues, and which the final form actually results from a negotiation of the different issues or tensions that arise during these workshops. Then the second formal, or the second element also of Postcards, are the presence of the kids, as you also suggested, which I think it's really important of why she chose to work or to propose this the workshop in an elementary school and not in a lycée, in a high school, because she actually produced another work in parallel to Postcards, which is I Want the Sand That I Want, in which she was filming the Lycée Saint-Hermy, a high school, again, completely self-run, in which she asked the teachers and the students to create a series of discussions around the critique of the necessity of schooling. Also the Lycée Saint-Hermy is really interesting in terms of its architecture, because it's one of the first schools which lacks any partitions, which is also an architectural model that has been used from radical pedagogies to new pedagogies or active pedagogies, but also in neoliberal regimes of education. And I think the third trait that we can mention in regards to Postcards is the pedagogical texture that the film performs, or that the film exposes not just the participant, but also the viewer. That means that the pedagogical moment and its representation both to be pedagogical, so that when we are watching the film, we are having the same texture, or we're feeling the same texture than actually the participants, the students, the kids of the film. And these were actually the three traits in which I didn't delve into text, but I think formally, and not just formally, but also politically and ethically, are very important resources that Adelita was putting into play in this work.
Yeah, I mean, it's very striking in the fact that by working with children, I mean, on every level. I mean, there are also some moments when we see a little girl actually filming, and then there's a close shot on what she's filming. I mean, there's also a question of I mean, the question of collaboration and authorship is also sort of like distributed in a very horizontal way. Yeah, what really strikes me in this piece is that by working with children, what we get is a kind of a magnified representation, or a caricature, but in a good way of adult society. I mean, these kids are actually amazing. I mean, in the way that, I mean, they have a maturity, and also, you know, they're all very articulate, but behind this you know, what comes from their being children, there's actually something already quite complex in the way that they can conceive of a society, and I mean, it's extremely impressive to see the details into which they get into when they discuss about you know, whether they should have prisons or not. And in the end, they say they should abolish prisons, and then abolish the town hall, because, you know, if you abolish prisons, then wouldn't the town hall still be a form of prison? At between 7 to 10, it's really amazing to have this maturity in thinking about organizing life. What did I want to say? Yeah, I don't know if I guess that was more of a comment, but
no, but still, I think like it actually prompts me to say that this comment actually shows how school, any form of like schooling institution or educational institution, education is just one thing that happens. It's really like the negotiation, the construction of an identity in society, an identity in common, and it's a place of betterment. So in one way or another, and which actually also, like in the present crisis of the pandemic, in which we are forced to be shunned off present classes in I mean, in life classes or life education, and we are all forced to online education. I mean, more or less forced, or because there's many forms of there's many people that are actually resistant to it. But well, I think it's really important to have this discussion, because in one way or another, the current crisis opens up to big questions, big philosophical questions. What is schooling for? What does it strive for? How to articulate education, teaching and learning in the current times? What is it for? How to do it? And there's one bottom line assumption that is always there, is that we need to decide, what do we want to spend time with and for, in terms of contents, in relations, and that's a school. I mean, it's this place, is this time also. The temporal dimension is really important, in which there's different relations to your way of seeing the world, of worldling the world, of understanding your relationship to others, to yourself. It's extremely important. So basically the piece of Adelita, I mean, it's really directed to that, to unearthing what are the social constructs of these kids. And if they, because they are having a different education, are they going to come up with an alternative form of society? And not just because they're having an alternative form of education, but because they come from families in which these ideas of what is power, what is a prison, what is an institution are discussed and articulated differently. And it's really interesting to see, like, throughout the piece, how there's certain forms of characterization that emerge from in the kids. I mean, even if it's undirected, you can really see how there's certain figures that take certain roles. No, there's going to be like the kid that is always going to vote for the prison, for the market, for the introduction of money, that is going to self-proclaim himself king at the end. And then there's the opposite one that represents the opposite force in a very naive, but in a very real way in the game. No? And that's actually another, that was actually like the idea of working with kids in the formal aspect of the work, was also to allow the playfulness and the game to infiltrate and to animate the whole logic and the whole format of the work. And maybe if you want, since you mentioned also the prisons, and we've been mentioning it also actually for the second time, we can show an excerpt of that final scene in which there's an assembly of the prisons, to see, for those who are following the conversation and have not been able to see the film. I'm going to share the screen.
Yeah.
Oui, je sais, parce que nous, on ne comprenait pas, on était étrangers. Pour quelque chose qui était... En plus, on avait les armes, alors ça avait très peur, on allait tout taper. Non, les armes, ils étaient là-bas. Oui, mais vas-y. Nous, on croyait que vous disiez, cassez-vous de là, c'est pas votre idée. Mais tu vas parler d'une... Une prison, déjà, c'est parce que si quelqu'un a fait du mal, et il ne va pas rester encore... faire du mal. Voilà, il faut quand même un peu une punition. Et en otage. Oui, il faudrait une punition parce que après, si on se plaint de lui et s'il recommence, c'est pas bien. Du coup, il devrait avoir une punition pour après savoir qu'il va plus recommencer à faire. Mais moi, par exemple, si on lui donne une prison d'une minute, il va dire, il va faire un truc de mal, de très mauvais. Une prison d'une minute, il va se dire, oh, bah, c'est cool, c'est qu'une seule minute, je vais en faire plein. Tandis qu'on pourrait le punir 5 minutes, il se dirait, là, si on le punit 5 minutes, quoi, 5 minutes, il ne faut plus que tu recommences, hein, parce que c'est long, je vais louper du temps de travail. Qui vote pour qu'il y ait une prison? Mais non, mais pas parce que tu as... Si t'as pas envie, c'est que tu fais pas de choses mal, hein. Tu n'iras pas en prison. Si tu vas cueillir une fleur, tu vas pas aller en prison. Je sais, mais j'ai pas envie qu'il y ait une prison. Comme punition, soit on lui dit va chercher une voiture, va tuer une bête, il la ramène dans le barbecue qu'on a. Je suis parce que je suis le plus fort de tout le monde. Qui vote pour que Ferrer soit le roi? Personne.
And jump into the end.
On va faire on va faire si vous voulez être libre, il faut enlever la mairie ici. Mais non, au contraire, c'est la mairie qui va être libre. S'ils disent pas de roi, on veut être libre, mais s'il y a une mairie, on n'est pas complètement libre. C'est vrai, donc moi, je ne vois pas vraiment l'intérêt de dire pas de roi, parce qu'il y a déjà une mairie. Donc ça sert un peu à rien. Pas de roi! 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 Mais quand il y a une mairie, on n'est pas complètement libre. Non, Adeena, elle n'est pas libre. Puisque c'est la mairie qui décide un peu les... Ouais. Donc en fait, elle peut mieux enlever la mairie d'abord, et après, on va se réunir pour être d'accord tous ensemble. Et comme ça, quand on fera des petits enfants, après ça, nous on va mourir, après eux ils vont faire des enfants et ça va continuer comme ça.
Okay, so I wanted also to jump to the end of the film. Sorry for the spoilers, because I think like this final debate really encapsulates a central tension, not just of the film, but actually the exhibition in which it was presented, which was playing truant at Gasworks in 2012, in which Adelita was really exploring and exposing the tension between on how the term free and the notion of freedom had been, on the one hand, always on the heart of all of the anarcho-collectivist experiences in education and also in communal living, from especially in Francesc Ferrer y Guardia Escuela Moderna, the modern school that then was developed in the US. And on the other hand, the instrumentalization of the term free and the notion of freedom in the neoliberal regime of education. And I think this last debate, it shows the kids really amazing discursive capacity to actually deconstruct like the different frameworks of institutionality, but actually also exposes these tensions which are very set in a very unconscious dimension, on a very conscious level.
One thing that I really wanted to ask, and I think is really relevant for the project of Afterall Art School as a whole, is where you said earlier that Postcards from the Desert Island itself functions as a I mean, it is a pedagogical tool or a resource to think and perhaps redefine pedagogy. And towards the end of your essay, you hint at well the situation we're in since around 2010, and which is probably accelerating at the moment. Mm-hmm. And you're very critical of a lot of the kind of neoliberal logics at work in art school nowadays. Yeah, you're very critical of this idea of the you mentioned the student as entrepreneur, the learner as user, and you quote something called the catering regime. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the main thread of your essay via your reading of Adelita's work consists in updating the Greek idea of Skhole. So yeah, we'd like to hear you on the current context and the new liberalization of art schools.
Mm-hmm. Well, that requires a very long answer, but I'll try to keep it short. Yes, so I think like it doesn't come as a surprise to anyone, especially like those of us who are engaging in this conversation, in this project, those of us who are either students or teachers in art schools, or just plainly schools, universities, colleges, high schools. The escalating forces of what now it's really easy to identify as a neoliberal regime in education. I think actually the last decade, so basically from the end, from the 2008 financial crisis to nowadays, there's been an escalating process of privatization of education of different forms. And actually, just as a note, you were mentioning before that many of the experiences of alternative education had, like, little by little disappeared from the 80s onwards, but actually they have disappeared from the public dimension. They're not public anymore, but they exist in the private sector. They exist as private options that, if you have the means, the resources, you can access them. So they have become as an elite form of education. And I'm saying this as a mother, and seeing like the different options that we have to raise our kids, and how, for example, also thinking from Spain, how in the public system they have, this has been strategically done in favor to these other private options. It's actually quite frightening, no? But coming back to this neoliberalization of education, and especially of art schools, the idea of this notion of the catering regime of neoliberal education, I take it from this book, Teaching Art in the Neoliberal Realm.
Pascal Guillen, yeah.
Yeah, Pascal Guillen and Paul de Bruyne, they are the ones who coined this idea of the catering regime. And the funny thing is that the book was published in 2012, and it has only been reaffirmed by practice and reality. This idea of catering, this idea of the student being a client, being a consumer who can choose what he wants to know, what he wants to be taught, how he wants to be taught, and teachers responding to these different demands, has resulted not in a more tailored, yes, in a more tailored, but not in a positive taylorism of education, but actually in a degradation of teaching, in the sense of being subjected to specific subjective needs instead of really having the content and the teaching of at the center, right? But also in terms of, I think, like it's much more visible and much more palpable in terms of, in structural terms, how this neoliberalization has amounted to an incredible increase of the administration and management in schools. I think, like, if you have like the numbers of how many people were in the departments of administration and management in art schools in the 2000s, and now they have multiplied if not by 3 or by 4. This has resulted in an increased bureaucratization, in which these managers have become permanent staff, and on the contrary, teachers, professors have lost their power in all of these structures, or have only been able to maintain their power if they were to comply to all the managerial logics. So this is one of the results, this increased bureaucratization of teaching, of education, of life. Then the second one is that is connected to this first one, is the pathological need to measure everything. So how to imply efficiency at all levels of performance, or how to transform and translate education into a performance, a ceaseless performance or form of performativity. And that goes for teaching as well as for learning. And you have it from the architecture of schools, which are glass, made of glass walls that have this multi or polyvalent space in the whole. They're all the same. They all follow the same model, in which they're not anymore kitchens, but cafeterias, etc., etc. So in which, like, the people who are there, either workers of of any type of task or students are part of a ceaseless monitoring and performance. I mean, it's a very schizophrenic model in which that balances openness and control and constant control, no? Mm-hmm. And then and that goes against for what I consider the core of education, which is the immeasurability of learning. Learning has to be something that cannot be, counted, that cannot be measured, that needs to overflow any form of these statistics, no? Mm-hmm. And and then the third trait would be this idea of the Taylorism, of everything on measure, responded to the needs and the demands to a student that has become an entrepreneur. And this is very much also in the thinking of Michel Fer, the political and theorist who has extensively written on the neoliberal condition and how we have become entrepreneurs of ourselves, how we are become a constant performance in which we are looking for the approval or the confirmation of throughout our performances and what we perform of ourselves, no? And sorry, my throat.
I think that that really gives us lots of material to discuss. But I would like to open the floor to the audience, and these questions are crucial, and we have quite a few members of professors from CSM, and also hopefully students from CSM. So I'm pretty sure that triggered lots of thoughts, and yeah, maybe Amber could.
Hi, thank you so much for that. That was such a relevant conversation, but also it's such an amazing artwork. So yeah, as Adeena said, if people should check that out as well after the conversation. Please send your questions through the chat. I'm sure there's lots of, I'm sure the conversation will provoke lots of thoughts in everyone. In the meantime, I hope you don't mind if I ask a question. Is that okay? Just to follow up on what you said about obviously resisting, measurement, bureaucratization, quantification. These are all really important kind of channels of resistance. I'm just wondering, particularly about what you said about the Skhole, the Greek idea of the Skhole, and how it's kind of disconnected from the oikos, the home, the polis, the kind of political life of the city. Like what the kind of current situation, as I'm asking this as as somebody who is kind of actively developing a school and thinking about pedagogy, as well as having had this really insightful reading of Postcards from the Desert Island. So I was just wondering if you had any reflections on what this kind of mixture of tentative kind of going back to school but also learning remotely, how the idea of the Skhole can be kind of maintained as a place where students can just be students and teachers can just be teachers, when there's this kind of bleeding between the place where you learn and the place where you work and have your life at home, and all of this. Basically what I'm asking is if you had any ideas on how this idea of a Skhole can be sort of cultivated without the physical space of a school. Anyways.
No, thank you so much for this question, Amber. I think like in the current crisis, there are so many things that are critical and that are happening at the same time, that we are, as you said, working from home, and trying to follow up if we are students or we are teachers, like the classes from home and online. And it's true that it has, like, this COVID pandemic has created a sort of fold in which all our spaces have been folding to each other, no? Like the domestic space, the working space, the intellectual space, the intimate space, etc., etc. I think, like, one of the first consequences of that is that it, well, as in all of the crises normally, is that it heightens our perception of social reproduction, in which education takes a great deal of part, no? So how the question of care, of caring, of well-being, of mental health, of betterment and wellness are very much revealed and exposed in these circumstances. And this of course connects to your question on Skhole, no? How can we actually take care and look after all these different traits and vectors and forces that are at play in schooling, in learning, in teaching, and that are cut by in the current circumstance. Of course, I think that the idea of Skhole, with all the libidinal charge that it has, with all the erotic charge that it has, I'm really sorry about my throat.
Take your time.
I mean, what I mean by erotic charge of learning and teaching, and this is something that I mentioned in the text, quoting Nishan Chan, an expert on education and pedagogy from the University of Artes in Arnhem in the Netherlands, in which we have to recognize that learning always occurs at a moment in which there is a central charge which overflows the imposed setting. So I think I'm going to have to take a candy while I speak.
Yeah,
do you
go for it.
Can we take a 1 minute break? Thank you.
Everyone can take a moment to reflect on their thoughts, think of more questions. I have another couple of questions come in.
Yeah, I see questions in the chat box,
yeah.
You know, in the Q&A box. I don't know if there are questions on YouTube.
Sorry, Julia.
No, can I just finish the question?
Yeah.
Because I didn't reply.
Please.
So, I think, like, there is a basis which cannot be done differently or cannot be done in distance. And of course, like, this online form of working can help us to find other ways of connection that are not the prototypical ones, no? I mean, I teach a class on research and study in, I mean, it's a study group at the Dutch Art Institute. And we've thought, I mean, it's not a master class. So it's not, basically, we don't have the tutors lecturing for 2 hours, but actually it's a functioning of the whole group together that needs to propose the working and the progress of the course. And that has been actually very challenging to find forms of allowing different forms of connection between us all in the class, different forms of rhythms of engagement and participation, which have been also been really important in the current conditions of constant visualization and online and social media and, you know, visual regime. So there are ways, but I think, and I'm a really defendant that that the Skhole, with all the forms it has of allowing free time, of allowing a space of profanation, of suspension, no, really need to happen in a physical space. I mean, of course, there's ways to balance that with different resources that can be online. But I think like the debate that normally happens in a seminar, it's really difficult to articulate it in a Zoom context. That we need to find, and we need to demand ways of being able to develop that in a physical space. Always, of course, complying with the medical requisites that this pandemic has imposed into us.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions, maybe. I'm trying to.
The first is from John Seth.
Yeah, I was wondering if we should which one we should answer first as a better segue. But yeah, let's go with John's question, which is, could you say a bit more about the connections to syndicalist models of thinking in Adelita Husni-Bey's work? How did these connections develop for her? If you could speak a bit about that.
Adelita, I mean, Adelita grew up mainly in Italy, also partly in Libya, but mainly in Italy. And it was during her youth, but also already when she was a student, that she became very interested in the autonomia and post-operaist movements, which have a great charge, or in which the syndicalist models have a great presence. She has had an interest and an engagement with syndicalism and the syndicalist models in a theoretical and in the theory that those have produced, and especially from in the 70s in Italy, but also now she lives in New York, so also in the United States. Different forms of syndicalism have been really close to her practice. No, the one I mentioned, she run and on local, no, the organization. But there's also many other projects in which she has engaged not just with the theory, but actually also organizations, and I don't know if I could say models, but at least methodologies or exercises. An important project in this sense is White Paper. It's a project that was chaptered in 3 countries, 3 exhibitions, 3 stages, which delves into land ownership and relationship with the law, but also with the imaginaries that this triangulation propels or projects. It's a very, you can find it online and all the details of this project, but I think that would be the most telling one in this sense, because she's really looking at how justice and the legal function in relation to housing, and what different experiences, what different forms of organization have countered the different injustices that have been historically been implemented. And in that sense, the syndicalism has been very important and very close to her research.
Actually, in the text, you also mention other examples which create suspended temporalities or different sites for different forms of collective experiences. So she has very transversal interests. I mean, it's not only syndicalist or anarchist methodologies and ideas, but you mentioned like tree-sitting protests and also raves. Yeah, I mean, there would be sites where I mean, because you mentioned like the liminal charge that exists in real life situation, and perhaps the needs to re-eroticize also teaching. But I think I don't know the work that is directly inspired by raves, but I would I could imagine that and we rarely talk about raves as a site to conduct politics differently. But in fact, just by having this gathering of bodies, which are now becoming very difficult, there is this potential to reorient, create breaches in the real and produce different affective bonds and affects. So yeah, that's just a comment.
Definitely. I've got a question from Alison, which is, thank you, Alison, which is, could you talk a little bit more about how the artwork can become a pedagogic tool? So she suggested perhaps about whether and how this worked in this way, whether and how the exhibition at Gasworks worked in that way as a pedagogic tool, and whether perhaps it could work differently now in that it's accessible as a video form on Vimeo. So the question is, what would you think about whether it needs to be whether it needs to be activated or put into play in new scenarios in order to work as a pedagogic tool? Does that make sense? Thank you.
I mean, I think like the film is already a pedagogical tool. It already enacts and activates a set of like different situation reflections that are central to our transformations. So that is already happening there. And in the excerpt we projected, there was, I think, like we could see these different moments in which like the students, the kids, are looking directly at the camera. But those are like recurrent moments throughout the film in which there's a take on consciousness, on the consciousness of the student, but also, of course, as a viewer who is reflecting themselves, himself, yourself, herself on the student, which is really clear and really powerful. And I think like the structure, the methodology are very, very clearly like thought over, without losing the spontaneity of the experiment, of the experience and the work. At Gasworks, for those of you who, I mean, you can, there's pictures in Gasworks website. So at Gasworks, Adelita really worked, and I think like also Robert Dickey, the curator, was really also helpful in that sense. They really worked in building the space. So basically the film is shown in a structure in which the background, this jungle-like background that you see in the film, was also implemented. So you had to sit in it's a wooden structure in which you had the background, the painted background on your back. You sat on the stairs and you watched the film. So already that different dispositif was making you part of the structure of the film and of the narrative. But then you had the whole space was covered. I mean, the whole central space of this was Gasworks before the works was covered in a timeline in which the different education acts that had been passed in the UK from the 70s, which is the cradle or the birthing moment. The moment in which neoliberalism started to be articulated in the different policies, with Margaret Thatcher, of course, so that was actually building a sort of like immersive panel in which the film and the structure stood in. So, of course, and the exhibition happened in 2012, at a moment in which the conservative coalition that were in power in UK were implementing a series of what they were calling free schools, which were actually privately run but state-funded and funded schools. Adelita was really replying or tensioning that current moment with these other alter examples. I think, as we said, in this last 8 years, things have actually been radicalized, have been further polarized in how education and so-called public education has been privatized to such a degree, in which these state schools or public schools have been furthermore, there's a series of policies that have managed these schools in which the resources and the curriculum that they used to develop has been diminished or practically lost. So of course, I think like the film works always as a revulsive or as a reaction to a current moment. I think it doesn't lose its force, but it has the capacity to re-signify the current moment and the current context with the different issues that it opens up.
Thank you. Unless we have any last questions, I think I don't want to keep you for too long, and it's been such a rich discussion. So I think we can. Oh no, wait. We do have a last question. This is another one from John Seth. Do you think that pedagogy is itself a model that needs to be put under question? I'm thinking exactly of the anti-psychiatry movement as providing a way to think through the anti-pedagogy. That's an interesting, yeah, okay.
Yeah, don't be sorry, thank you. I think pedagogy is not a model. I think pedagogy is a force, is a methodology, can be a structure, and we can criticize different or specific pedagogies. You can be that, I don't know, Montessori or Steiner's, or more kind of like ideological ones. I mean, they're all ideological, but I think such as the current ones or the art school or a specific art school or etc. We can criticize that, and we can undo and that can be put under question always. But I think like pedagogy as a bigger framework as a praxis, because pedagogy is a practice as much as it is a form of producing knowledge and different methodologies to know. That's actually a field to invent and to reinvent every day.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you to everyone who has come. Thank you for your questions. This conversation will be archived on Central St. Martin's YouTube channel, and it will also be archived on our new art school website, which, as Adeena mentioned before, was Afterall Artschool, or on word.org. Julia's essay is also there for you to read if you haven't already, and essays accompanying all of the other events that we're holding this month. So yeah, I'll say thank you very much to both of you. Thanks, Adeena, and goodbye.
Julia, Amber, everyone.
Bye.
See you next Monday.
Thank you so much.
See you next Monday at 6 p.m. next Monday.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye. Bye.